He gave his grandson everything, his estate, money, a future. And then his grandson hung up, never to call again. 82 years old, Harold Whitmore sits alone in the small room his grandson arranged for him, far from the house he built with a lifetime of sweat and tears. No one visits. No one asks how he is. Only silence. But Harold doesn't cry. He just opens a drawer, takes out a small USB drive, and smiles. Because he knows the day it all falls apart is very near. If you think you've ever been betrayed, watch this story to the end. Like to support the channel and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come. Now, let's begin. I used to think the worst kind of loneliness was losing someone you loved. I was wrong. The worst kind of loneliness is being discarded by someone you poured your whole life into. Someone who smiled at your funeral before you were even in the ground. My name is Harold Whitmore. I am 82 years old. I built a manufacturing company from a rented warehouse and 2 second-hand machines in a city that didn't know my name. I buried a wife I loved for 41 years. I raised a grandson who was not my blood obligation, but became the center of everything I did for the last 2 decades of my life. And I watched that grandson become a stranger the moment the ink dried on his inheritance papers. This is not a story I wanted to tell. There was a version of me, the version that existed 6 months before the end. Who would have gone quietly? Who would have accepted the silence, the cold phone calls, the visits that never came? Who would have convinced himself that this was simply the way of things, that old men outlive their usefulness, that family changes, that the boy he raised was still in there somewhere, underneath all that money and pride? But I'm not that version of myself anymore. And before I go, before everything I built gets swallowed up by people who never once asked me how I was feeling, I want the record to be straight. I need to go back. All the way back to the beginning, so you understand what I'm talking about when I say I gave Ethan everything. His name is Ethan Cole. His mother, my daughter Sandra, left when he was 4 years old. She had problems I won't pretend to fully understand, and eventually those problems took her to places from which she did not return. Not death, at least not then. Just absence. The kind of absence that doesn't announce itself. One day she was there, and then she wasn't. And Ethan was sitting on my porch with a backpack that had a cartoon dinosaur on it, and my wife Ruth was already at the door pulling him inside before I even had time to process what was happening. Ruth was like that. She didn't need time to process things. She just acted. She loved first and asked questions much later, if at all. She was the one who turned that extra bedroom into a boys' room. She was the one who enrolled him in school, who showed up to parent-teacher conferences, who sat with him at the kitchen table doing math homework that she herself barely remembered how to do. I worked. That's what I did. Whitmore Manufacturing didn't build itself, and by the time Ethan came to live with us, I was in the middle of a production contract that was either going to save the company or sink it. I was at the plant by 5 in the morning and back after dark, 6 days a week. But I was there on Sundays. Sundays were non-negotiable. Ethan and I had a ritual. We'd take the truck out early before Ruth woke up, and we'd go to this diner called Patsy's out on Route 11. They had booths with cracked vinyl seats and coffee so strong it could strip paint, and the waitress, a woman named Dot with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead, always saved us the corner booth. Ethan would order the short stack with extra butter, and I'd have eggs over easy, and we'd sit there for 2 hours sometimes, just talking, or not talking. Sometimes just sitting, which is its own kind of talking when you're comfortable with someone. He was a bright kid. I'm not saying that because he was mine. He genuinely was. Sharp questions, fast with numbers, curious about how things worked. He'd come to the plant on summer days sometimes and follow me around the floor, asking about machinery he had no business understanding at age 9. The workers liked him. He had this quality, even as a kid, where people wanted to explain things to him, where you felt like what you said mattered to him. I don't know when that quality disappeared, or maybe it didn't disappear. Maybe it just turned inward. Maybe he kept it and learned to use it differently, not to absorb, but to extract. Ruth died when Ethan was 17. Pancreatic cancer, which is the kind that doesn't give you much warning and even less mercy. She was diagnosed in February and gone by October of the same year. 8 months, and then she was just not there anymore. The corner of every room where she should have been standing was suddenly just a corner. Ethan was gutted. I know that. Whatever else happened later, I know that her death cracked something open in him that never fully healed. He'd come home from school and just sit in the kitchen, at the chair she always sat in, staring at nothing. He stopped eating right for a while. His grades slipped, then recovered, then slipped again. I didn't handle it well either, if I'm being honest. I threw myself into work, the way I always did when I didn't know how to feel something. The plant needed me. The orders were coming in. There was always something to manage, something to fix, something that kept me from sitting in the kitchen staring at the chair. We got through it the way the Whitmore family gets through most things. Separately, and without talking about it, and then pretending we had. By the time Ethan graduated high school, he was himself again, or he seemed to be. He had a girlfriend, a part-time job, a group of friends I'd meet occasionally, and mostly forget. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't reckless. He was fine. He was the kind of fine that could mean everything or nothing depending on what was underneath it. I paid for his college. Business degree, which he chose himself. He was good at it. Not spectacular, but competent. And competence is underrated. He graduated, came back to the area, and I offered him a position at Whitmore Manufacturing. Junior manager, supply chain. Nothing handed to him, I told him that clearly. He'd work for it like anyone else. He said he understood. He worked hard those first few years. I'll give him that. He came in early, asked the right people the right questions, made a few decisions that I'd have made differently, but that turned out to be sound. The staff respected him. I told him, maybe 3 years into it, that I was proud of him. I remember the look on his face. He was standing near the window in my office, and the afternoon light was coming through, and for a moment he looked exactly like the kid at the diner. Exactly like that boy. "That means a lot, Grandpa," he said. And I believed him. I believed every word of it. Kid. When I turned 78, my attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had handled Whitmore family affairs for almost 30 years, sat me down and had what he called a clarity conversation. This was his way of saying, "You're getting older, Harold, and the longer you wait to formalize things, the messier it gets for the people you leave behind." I didn't argue. I'd watched enough people wait too long and leave behind chaos and resentment, and family members who stopped speaking to each other over things that could have been settled with 30 minutes of paperwork. I had other relatives, of course. My brother's children, Dale, a nephew who'd grown up in Phoenix and ran a small landscaping business. Miriam, a niece who worked as a school librarian and had 3 kids. And my cousin's daughter, Irene, who lived locally and had helped me more than I ever publicly acknowledged after Ruth died. She brought me meals. She showed up on holidays without being asked. She was the kind of person who just appears when you need someone and never mentions it afterward. But Ethan was who I thought of first. Ethan was the one I'd raised. Ethan was the one who carried the Whitmore name into the next chapter of the business. The estate was valued at approximately $14 million by that point. The manufacturing company, 2 commercial properties, a residential property I'd held for years as an investment, retirement accounts, and some other assets. Not obscene wealth, the kind of wealth that takes a lifetime to accumulate and can be lost faster than most people think. I divided it the way I thought was fair. Ethan got the largest share, the company itself, 60% of the liquid assets, and the family estate. The remaining 40% I split between Irene, Dale, Miriam, and a small charitable foundation I'd been running quietly for years, the Whitmore Community Fund, which paid for after-school tutoring programs in the district where the plant was located. Ruth had started it. I maintained it. I sat Ethan down before we signed anything, just the 2 of us, at the kitchen table in the house he was about to inherit. "I need you to understand something," I said. "This isn't just money. This is people's livelihoods. 63 employees at the plant, their families, the programs your grandmother built. If you're going to carry this, you have to carry all of it." He looked at me steadily. He had this way of looking at you that made you feel heard, that quality again, the one he had as a boy. "I understand, Grandpa. I won't let you down." Gerald filed the paperwork the following week. The change didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about this kind of betrayal. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a confrontation or an argument or a moment you can point to and say, there. That was when everything broke. It happened in increments, small things first. The Sunday calls I used to get. Ethan would call on Sunday afternoons, fill me in on the week, ask how I was feeling. Those started coming less regularly. Once every 2 weeks, then once a month. Then I'd be the one calling, and the phone would ring out, and he'd text back hours later. Sorry, crazy week. Talk soon. Talk soon. I collected those texts for a while. Not literally, but in my head. I'd reread them. Try to figure out if I was reading too much into tone that didn't exist in a text message. Tell myself I was being an old man about it. About 4 months after the estate was formalized, I stopped by the plant unannounced. I still had an office there, technically. I'd kept a small one in the back, near the production floor. I'd gone in a few times a week just to keep my hand in things, to stay useful. That day, when I walked in, I noticed that my office door had a new nameplate on it. It said, Acquisition Storage. My desk was gone. Filing cabinet sat where my chair used to be. I stood there in the doorway for a moment. A young woman I didn't recognize walked past, glanced at me, and kept walking. I found Tommy Reyes, one of the floor supervisors who'd worked for me for 12 years, coming out of the break room with a coffee. His face did something complicated when he saw me. Mr. Whitmore, he said, I didn't know you were coming by. I didn't know I needed an appointment, I said. The silence between us was enough. I left without saying anything to anyone else. Drove back to the house, the family estate that I'd technically transferred to Ethan but still lived in, which had been the arrangement when we drew up the paperwork. I had my rooms on the east wing, Ethan had the main house, and it had seemed perfectly workable at the time. When I got home, Ethan's girlfriend, a woman named Claire, who I'd met perhaps 4 times, was in my living room talking on her phone. She looked at me when I walked in the way you look at a repairman who's arrived at an inconvenient moment. Oh, she said, covering the phone. Harold, I didn't realize you'd be home. I live here, I said. She smiled the kind of smile that isn't a smile and went back to her call. The conversation with Ethan happened that evening. I found him in the kitchen making himself a drink, the good whiskey, the bottle I'd kept for special occasions. My office is gone, I said. He looked up. No surprise on his face. None. I should have mentioned that, he said. We needed the space for a new inventory system. The back office just made more sense logistically. I've had that office for 22 years. I know, and I appreciate what it means to you, but the business needs to evolve, Grandpa. You've always said that yourself. Adapt or fall behind. He said it so smoothly, used my own words like a key he'd copied without asking. You could have talked to me first, I said. He picked up his drink, took a slow sip, and looked at me in a way I hadn't seen before. Not angry, worse than angry, patient, the way people are patient with someone they've already written off. I'll do better about communicating, he said. I've just been busy. It's a lot to manage. He walked out of the kitchen, and I stood there next to the counter where I'd made 1,000 meals, where Ruth had stood chopping vegetables and singing off key, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break. Shift. Like something was getting into position. I tried. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me that you understand. I did not give up without trying. I called Ethan's cell phone 12 times over the next 6 weeks. He answered 3 of those calls. Each conversation was brief, surface level, and ended with him telling me he had to go. I sent him a letter, an actual paper letter written by hand, 3 pages, about what I was observing, about my concerns for the plant, for the employees, for the community fund. I kept the tone calm. I did not accuse. I asked questions. He never acknowledged receiving it. I reached out to his friend Marcus, a man Ethan had known since college and whom I'd always liked, and asked if he could help me get a real conversation with Ethan. Marcus was uncomfortable. He said Ethan was fine, just going through a transition period. The phrase had a rehearsed quality that told me Marcus had been coached on what to say if I called. My nephew Dale called me in early March, 3 months into all of this. He'd heard something. He wasn't specific about where, and he was concerned. Uncle Harold, he said, are you all right? Are you actually all right? I'm fine, I said automatically. because I heard things have changed around there with Ethan, and I just want to. I said, I'm fine, Dale. I hung up. And then I sat in my chair for a very long time, looking at the wall, and thought about what it means to say you're fine when you're not. When you've been saying it so long that the word has stopped having any meaning at all. The worst moment, and there were several candidates for this, came on a Tuesday in April. I know it was a Tuesday because I'd had a doctor's appointment in the morning. Routine blood work, nothing serious, but I'd asked Ethan 2 weeks earlier if he could drive me since my vision had been giving me trouble, and I wasn't comfortable on the highway anymore. He'd said yes. He'd said he'd move some things around. Tuesday morning, 7:30. I was ready. Dressed, waiting by the front door. My coat on, the address of the clinic written on a card in my pocket the way I'd started doing things since my memory got less reliable. 7:45, 8 o'clock. I called his cell. It rang through to voicemail. I sat down on the bench by the front door. A bench Ruth had painted yellow years ago, chipped now and faded, and I waited 15 more minutes. Then I called a taxi. The driver, a young man who talked too much about sports radio, dropped me at the clinic, and I made my appointment and rode home in another cab and got back to the house at noon. Ethan's car was in the driveway. He was home. I found him in the study on a video call with someone, laptop open, coffee on the table. He saw me in the doorway and held up one finger one moment, without interrupting his call. I waited. When he finally ended the call, he turned to me and said, "How'd the appointment go?" Just like that. How'd the appointment go? Like he hadn't agreed to take me, like I hadn't spent 40 minutes on a cold front porch waiting for him. "I took a cab," I said. Something crossed his face. Not guilt. Inconvenience. Like I was pointing out something tedious. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "This deal came up this morning and I couldn't reschedule. You could have called me."
Bums.
"I thought I texted you." He hadn't. I checked. He hadn't. "Grandpa," he said, leaning back in his chair, and there it was again. That patience, that careful, managed patience. "Maybe it's time we talked about some practical arrangements. You need reliable transportation, medical support, things that should probably be handled by people who are more equipped for that kind of thing." I looked at him. "Are you saying you want to put me somewhere?" "I'm saying I want you to have appropriate care." There was a long silence. "I raised you," I said. He looked at his laptop. "I know you did." 3 weeks later, I moved out of the family estate. It wasn't voluntary, not entirely, though I told everyone it was. I told Dale it was. I told Irene when she came by with dinner on a Thursday and found me packing boxes. I kept my voice level and my face composed, and I said it was a practical decision, that the house was too big, that it made sense. Irene stood in the middle of my bedroom watching me fold shirts into a suitcase, and she didn't say a word for a long time. Then she said, "Harold, you don't have to pretend with me." I kept folding. "I'm not pretending anything. You built that house. Ruth planted those roses in the front yard. You don't have to leave because that boy wants you to leave." I put the shirt down. I pressed my hands flat on the lid of the suitcase and stood there for a moment, not looking at her. "He's not a boy anymore," I said. "He's a man who made a choice, and I made mine." The apartment was small. Second floor of a building downtown, 2 bedrooms I didn't need, a kitchen that smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes, no matter how many times I cleaned it. The window faced a parking structure. It was nothing like the house where I'd spent 40 years of my life. But it was mine, the only thing left that was entirely mine. And late at night, when the parking structure lights came through the blinds and the building settled around me with its unfamiliar sounds, I'd open the drawer of my nightstand and take out a small leather notebook. I'd been keeping it for months by then, long before the move, long before the office, before the taxi, before the Tuesday morning on the yellow bench. I started keeping it the night I stood in that kitchen and saw the look in Ethan's eyes, the one that told me everything. I wrote things down, everything I could remember in order, with dates when I had them. I wrote about the office, about the letter he never acknowledged, about Marcus's rehearsed words, about the taxi, about the look. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew one thing, and I knew it with the particular clarity that comes when you finally stopped lying to yourself. I was not going to go quietly. The boy I raised had made his choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. The apartment on Delaware Street smelled like cigarettes for 6 weeks before it finally didn't anymore. I don't know what changed. Maybe I just stopped noticing. That happens when you're 82, not the losing of senses, but the adjusting. The quiet recalibration your body does when it accepts that this is the new normal now. This window, this parking structure, this kitchen with the wrong-sized burners and the drawer that sticks. You stop fighting the unfamiliarity and you just absorb it. I told myself that was strength. Some mornings I even believed it. Irene called every few days. Not to check on me, she was careful to frame it that way. She'd call with a reason. A question about whether I wanted her to bring anything. A piece of local news she thought I'd find interesting. A complaint about her car that she actually wanted my opinion on. She was smart enough to know that I wouldn't pick up for sympathy, but I'd pick up for usefulness, so she kept making herself useful as a reason to call. I appreciated it more than I told her. Dale called once a week from Phoenix, usually Sunday evenings, and he didn't try to be subtle at all. He'd just say, "How are you actually doing, Uncle Harold?" with the emphasis on actually, and I'd give him a version of the truth that was edited enough to keep him from flying out here and making a scene. Because that was the thing I was most afraid of in those early months in the apartment. Not loneliness, not the health stuff, which was manageable. I was afraid that if I said too much, someone would do something, and Ethan would find out. And whatever I was quietly building, that notebook in the nightstand, those careful pages of dates and conversations, would be exposed before it was finished. I wasn't ready. Not yet. So I edited. I performed fine. I got very good at it. No, it was Irene who first told me what was being said about me. She came by on a Wednesday afternoon in late May with a container of soup I hadn't asked for and a look on her face that told me the soup was not really the point. She set it on the counter, kept her coat on, the way people do when they're not sure if they're staying, and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not shoot the messenger." "I never shoot messengers," I said. "I just make them wish I had." She almost smiled. Almost. "People are talking," she said, "at the family level, about you, about the estate. He's been saying things." I poured 2 cups of coffee I knew she'd drink, even if she said she wasn't staying. "What kind of things?" She sat down, wrapped both hands around the mug. "That you were becoming difficult to manage, that you'd been confused lately, repeating yourself, that the move to the apartment was actually your idea because the estate was getting to be too much for you to handle mentally." I heard the words. Each one landed with a specific weight. "He's telling people I'm losing my mind," I said. "He's not saying it that directly. He's being careful. It's more like a tone, a set of small things. He told Miriam that you'd shown up to the plant twice without remembering you'd already been. He told Dale's wife that you'd left a stove burner on at the estate and it had been a safety concern. I've never left a burner on in my life." "I know that." "Miriam believes him?" Irene looked at her coffee. "Miriam wants to believe him. It's easier than the alternative." That was the most painful part. Not the lie, but the appetite for the lie. The way some people will accept a story that lets them off the hook, that gives them a reason not to have to do anything, not to have to feel guilty about the distance they've already put between themselves and a problem they'd rather not look at. Ethan knew his audience. He always had. I sat with that for a long moment. "What about you?" I said. "Do you believe him?" Irene looked at me directly. She had her mother's eyes, my cousin Vera's eyes, steady and with no performance in them. "I've never believed a single word that boy says," she said. "Not since I watched him turn into someone I don't recognize." I should tell you about Claire. Ethan's girlfriend had moved into the estate by June. Fully moved. Closets, furniture rearranged, a decorator brought in to change things that did not need changing. Ruth's roses in the front garden got pulled out in early July to make room for what Claire called a cleaner landscape. Boxwood hedges. Very symmetrical. Very impersonal. Irene drove past the house one afternoon and called me from her car. "Harold," she said, and her voice had that specific flatness it got when she was trying to stay calm. "Ruth's roses are gone." I didn't say anything. "All of them. The whole bed. They put in hedges." I looked at the wall of my apartment, at the small framed photograph I'd brought with me when I left. Ruth in the garden, summer, one of those roses in her hand, laughing at something off camera. I'd taken the picture. I remembered the day. I remembered the sound of her laugh. "Okay," I said. "Harold, it's okay, Irene." It wasn't okay. But there are things you file away. Things you add to the notebook, not because they're evidence of a legal wrong, but because they belong in the record of what a person is, what they're capable of, what they reveal about themselves when they think nobody is keeping score. I was keeping score. The first time I heard Ethan speak about me in a way that was fully, unmistakably contemptuous, not just dismissive, not just impatient, but contemptuous, was at his cousin Marcus's birthday gathering in August. I shouldn't have been there. I knew it when I agreed to come. Irene had been invited, and she'd told me about it, and something in me, some stubborn, foolish remnant of the man I used to be, decided I was going to show up. I was going to walk into a room full of people who had known me for decades, and I was going to hold my head up and let them see that Harold Whitmore was still standing. It was a poor decision. I've made them. The party was at a restaurant Ethan had rented out for the evening. About 40 people, a private room, that kind of money-is-no-object atmosphere that Ethan had slipped into naturally, the way some people slip into a warm bath. Claire was there in a dress that cost more than my first car. Ethan was at the center of everything, the way he always was in a room now. Not because people were drawn to him, I realized, but because he positioned himself there. He'd learned how to occupy space in a way that made it seem like the space had always been his. He saw me when I walked in. Something shifted in his face, a flicker of something he covered quickly. And then he smiled and crossed the room and shook my hand. "Grandpa, I didn't know you were coming." "Marcus invited me," I said. 40 years I've known that boy's family." "Of course," he said. "Great that you're here." He steered me toward a corner table, handed me a drink I hadn't asked for, and then returned to his orbit. And I sat there for most of the evening, nursing the drink, watching the room. About an hour in, I went to find the men's room. The hallway outside was narrow and turned a corner, and around that corner, Ethan was standing with two men I recognized vaguely, business associates, the kind of men who wear their watch brands as a form of introduction. They hadn't heard me coming. "Don't get me wrong, he built something real," Ethan was saying, 30 years ago. "But the industry's changed, and he doesn't get that. He still thinks it's the 90s. You can't run a company with that mentality." One of the men said something I didn't catch. "He's fine," Ethan said. "He's comfortable. He's got his apartment, his routines. Honestly, he's happier now than he was at the estate. Too much space for one person." There was a short laugh. Then the other man said, "Still, giving up that house." "He didn't give it up," Ethan said. "I helped him see what made sense. Sometimes you have to help people make the right choices, especially when they're not fully," a pause, deliberate, loaded, "all there anymore." I stood in that hallway and did not move. I'm not going to describe what happened inside me in that moment, because some things don't translate. Some moments live in the body in a way that words just sketch around the edges of. I'll say this. I stood there, and I heard my grandson describe me to strangers as a man who was not fully all there. And I thought of the plant I built, and the contracts I negotiated, and the night shifts I pulled in my 40s to make payroll, and the boy sitting in a cracked vinyl booth ordering short stacks at Patsy's Diner. And I thought, he is not going to get away with this. I went to the men's room. I washed my hands. I dried them carefully. I walked back into the party, said goodbye to Marcus, told him happy birthday, and left. In the car, Irene was driving me. She looked at my face and didn't ask a single question. She just drove. When we got to my building, she said, "Do you want me to come up?" "No," I said. "I need to make some calls." She nodded once. "Okay." I went upstairs, sat down at the small desk I'd put near the window, and opened my laptop. It was late, nearly 11. But Gerald Fitch had given me his personal cell number years ago with the standing instruction that I could use it if something was urgent. I hadn't used it once. Not once, in all the years I'd had it. I used it that night. He picked up on the third ring. "Harold," he said, voice thick with the edge of sleep. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said. "I need to talk to you about some things. Not tonight. I know it's late. But soon, Gerald. Very soon." A pause. "What kind of things?" I looked out the window at the parking structure, at the lights across the city, at my own reflection in the dark glass. An old man at a desk, alone, at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. "The kind that can't wait much longer," I said. "Look." Gerald came to the apartment 2 days later. I'd never had Gerald in a space this small before. He'd always come to the estate, to my office, to proper rooms with proper furniture. Seeing him folded into the armchair across from my second-hand couch felt strange, like the wrong background for a familiar painting. I gave him the notebook. He read it for almost 20 minutes without saying anything. I made coffee. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the silence, to the sound of pages turning, to the occasional pause. When he finally looked up, his expression was careful in the particular way of men who've spent careers learning to control their faces. "How long have you been keeping this?" he said. "Since February." "You didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." He set the notebook down on the cushion beside him and folded his hands in the way he does when he's thinking through several things at once. "Harold, some of this, the office, the living arrangement, the things being said to family members, some of it is painful, but it isn't necessarily actionable on its own." "I know that," I said. "That's not what I'm asking you about." He waited. "I need to know what it would take," I said, "to amend the estate. Not revoke everything. I'm not interested in scorched earth, but to restructure, to make sure the things I actually care about are protected. The community fund, the employees, the people who deserve something." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Is this about Ethan specifically?" "It's about making sure what I built outlasts what he's doing to it," I said. "They're not always the same thing." He leaned forward, put his elbows on his knees. "You understand that if you make significant amendments, he'll contest it. He'll bring up the question of your competency. He's already laid groundwork for that argument, if what you've written here is accurate." "It's accurate." "Then we'll need documentation beyond the notebook. We'll need to establish, clearly and legally, that you are fully competent to make these decisions. That means evaluations. That means a paper trail." "Fine." "And Harold, it means keeping this quiet. Not telling anyone, not even Irene, until we're further along. If Ethan gets wind of this before we're ready—" "I know," I said. "I've been quiet for months. I can stay quiet." Gerald picked up the notebook again, looked at it once more with the eyes of a man calculating distances. "There's one more thing I want to do," I said. "Something separate from the legal documentation, something I need your help setting up." He looked at me. "What is it?" I told him. Gerald was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that I wondered if I'd gone too far. Then he said, "You know that's going to be... the room is going to be very different after that." "Yes," I said, "that's the point." "And you're sure you want to do it that way? You could handle this with paperwork alone. You don't have to—" "Gerald," I looked at him steadily. He stood in a hallway and told two strangers I wasn't all there. He took my office. He pulled out Ruth's roses. He let me sit on a bench in the cold for 45 minutes and then asked how the appointment went, like I was the one who'd forgotten. I picked up my coffee. He needs to hear me, not a lawyer, not a letter, me, even if I'm not in the room when he does. Gerald held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's figure out how to do this right." Buzz. The months that followed were the strangest of my life, and I've had some strange ones. On the surface, nothing changed. I lived in the apartment. I kept my routines. I had coffee with Irene on Thursdays, calls with Dale on Sundays, visits to my cardiologist on the second Tuesday of every month. I did not contact Ethan. I did not appear at the plant. I let the silence between us settle into something that, from the outside, probably looked like acceptance. It wasn't acceptance. I met with Gerald 7 times over 4 months. I sat through 2 separate competency evaluations that were thorough enough to be irritating and conclusive enough to be useful. I worked with a specialist Gerald brought in, a methodical woman named Dr. Anise Patel, who spent 3 sessions asking me questions about my memory and my judgment and my understanding of the legal decisions I was making. She was good at her job. She didn't flatter me, didn't rush me, didn't treat me like a liability. She treated me like a man making decisions. That alone felt like something I hadn't experienced in a long time. I also started a video. That had been my idea. The thing I'd told Gerald about that night in the apartment. Not written. Not a letter. Not a legal brief. A recording. My face. My voice. My words. In a format that couldn't be misread or misattributed or argued over by people who'd never met me. I recorded it over 3 separate sittings. The first 2 weren't right. I was too stiff, too lawyerly, too much the Harold Whitmore who ran boardrooms and kept his face arranged. I told Gerald to delete them both. The 3rd sitting, I stopped trying to perform. I just talked. I talked about Ruth, about the plant floor at 5 in the morning, about what it costs to make payroll when you're not sure you can. About a boy with a cartoon dinosaur backpack, about a cracked vinyl booth and short stacks with extra butter and a waitress who saved us the corner table. About everything I had given, freely, without condition, because I believed that's what love was. That's what family was. And then I talked about what happened after. All of it, in order, with the dates. I talked for a long time. When I stopped, the room was very quiet. Gerald, who had been sitting off to the side, was looking at his hands. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then he said quietly, "Harold, that was..." And then he stopped and cleared his throat. "The family needs to hear that." "They will," I said. "When the time comes." Outside my window, the parking structure lights were coming on. The city was moving into evening. Somewhere across town, in the house I'd built, in the rooms where my wife had hung curtains and planted roses and made a home, Ethan was living the life he'd engineered for himself, with no idea what was waiting. I closed the notebook, put it in my desk drawer. I was tired. More tired than I'd let myself feel in months. The kind of tired that sits in your bones after you've been holding yourself together through an act of will for too long. But underneath the tired, something else. Something that had been growing quietly since the night I stood in that hallway and heard my grandson's voice. I wasn't afraid anymore. And that, in the end, was the most important thing. I died on a Thursday morning in late January. I say it that plainly because that's how it felt to me when Gerald called Irene. I had asked him to call Irene first, and she drove to the apartment and found me already gone. A cardiac event, the paramedics said. Quick. No suffering as far as anyone could tell. I was in my chair by the window, the one facing the parking structure, and the lamp beside me was still on. I know these details because Irene told them to Dale, and Dale told them to me eventually, in the way that living people reconstruct the endings of other people's stories and pass them around like something that needs to be handled carefully. Obviously, I'm not telling this from the other side of death. I'm telling it the way I recorded it, the way I sat down in front of that camera and spoke directly to the people who would be left in that room after I was gone, and I'm letting you hear what they heard. Because what happened in that conference room at Gerald Fitch's law office on a Wednesday morning in April, 3 months after my death, is really where this story has its center of gravity. Everything before it was the fuse. That morning was the match. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The weeks between January and April were, by all accounts, a performance. Ethan handled the funeral arrangements. He did it efficiently, I will give him that, and the service was attended by people who had known me for decades, people from the plant, people from the neighborhood where I'd lived my whole adult life. Tommy Reyes came and stood near the back and didn't say much to anyone. Irene sat in the front row and kept her face composed in a way that I know cost her something. Dale flew in from Phoenix with his wife and stood too stiff the whole time, the way people stand when they're managing grief they didn't expect to feel so sharply. Ethan gave a eulogy. From what Irene described to me later, and she described it with the particular precision of someone who wants the record accurate, it was polished. It was moving in a way that required no actual emotion from the speaker. He talked about my work ethic, my dedication to the business, my old-fashioned values. He called me a self-made man. He did not mention Ruth. He did not mention Patsy's Diner or Sunday mornings or a cartoon dinosaur on a small backpack. He kept it broad, kept it safe, kept it exactly in the lane of a man performing grief for an audience. Claire stood beside him the entire time, looking appropriately somber. 3 days after the funeral, Ethan called Gerald's office to ask about the estate timeline. Gerald told me later he'd expected this. He wasn't surprised by the call. He was, if anything, surprised it took 3 days. He told Ethan the formal closing would require approximately 3 months to process, that there were assets to verify, accounts to settle, the usual procedures. Ethan asked if the timeline could be accelerated. Gerald said he would do his best. He did not mention the video. He did not mention the amendments. He said nothing about what was waiting, because that was what I had asked him to do. I had asked him to let Ethan believe, fully and completely, that everything was going exactly as Ethan expected it to go. I wanted him comfortable. I wanted him settled. I wanted him walking into that conference room in April with the absolute confidence of a man who has already counted his money, because that was the only way it would work. The only way the room would feel the way it needed to feel when everything changed. Gerald called Irene in early March to tell her privately what to expect. He did the same for Dale, for Miriam, though Miriam's call was shorter and more carefully worded, and for the 2 other beneficiaries who would be present. He told them each separately that the estate closing would be different from what they might be anticipating. He did not tell them how. He said only, "Please come. Please be there." Irene called me. Called him, I mean. She called Gerald after she got the call and asked what was happening. "Trust Harold," he told her. She was quiet for a moment. "Is there something in the estate documents?" she asked. "There is something," Gerald said. "That's all I can tell you right now." She told me later that she sat in her car for a few minutes after that call, in the parking lot of the grocery store where she'd pulled over to take it, and she just sat there with the engine off. She didn't cry. She said she just felt me. Felt me the way you feel a person who's left a room but left something of themselves in the air. I hope that's true. I like to think some part of me was paying attention. Well, April came with that particular quality spring has in this part of the country. Still cold in the mornings, with the suggestion of warmth that burns off by noon before you've had a chance to trust it. Gerald's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, a conference room with a long table and windows that overlooked the street, and by 9:30 in the morning, everyone who mattered was in it. Ethan arrived with Claire and with a man I didn't recognize. A young attorney, Irene said, someone Ethan had brought to protect his interests. He was wearing a suit that was too expensive for the occasion and carrying a leather portfolio that he set on the table in front of him, like a statement. He introduced himself as Ethan's personal legal counsel and then said nothing else, just sat and observed. Ethan himself was relaxed in the way of a man who has prepared for a proceeding he considers a formality. Irene was already there when they arrived. Dale sat beside her, having flown in the night before. Miriam came in a few minutes after Ethan, took a seat near the far end of the table, and busied herself looking at her phone. Gerald opened the proceedings with the standard language: verification of identity, confirmation of all parties present, summary of the estate's primary structure. His voice was its usual measured professional self. Nothing in his delivery suggested that anything about this morning was out of the ordinary. Ethan's attorney made a note on his pad. Claire kept her hands folded in her lap and looked at the window. Then Gerald set down his papers. "Before we proceed to the distribution summary," he said, "Mr. Whitmore left a specific instruction regarding this meeting. He asked that a recorded statement be played for all parties prior to the disclosure of any amendments to the estate documents." There was a pause in the room. Ethan straightened slightly. "A recorded statement?" "A video," Gerald said. "Recorded by Harold Whitmore approximately 4 months before his death, witnessed, notarized, and filed as part of the official estate record." Ethan's attorney leaned forward. "We weren't informed of any—" "It's part of the estate record," Gerald said, with the calm of a man who has anticipated every objection in this room. "It is not subject to prior disclosure requirements. Mr. Whitmore had every legal right to include it, and its existence was confirmed by 2 independent estate attorneys." He looked at Ethan's counsel directly. If you'd like to verify that before we proceed, I'm happy to step out. A short silence. That won't be necessary, Ethan said. His voice was still level, still in control. Let's see it. Gerald nodded to his assistant, who dimmed the light slightly and connected the laptop to the screen at the end of the table. And then there I was. I've thought about what it must have been like for the people in that room to see my face on that screen, to hear my voice, to watch an old man they'd buried 3 months ago sit in a small apartment with a parking structure visible through the window behind him, look directly into a camera, and begin to speak. I looked tired in the video. I hadn't noticed that when we recorded it, or maybe I noticed and didn't care. I was 81 when we filmed it. My hair was thinner than it used to be, and I was wearing the gray cardigan Ruth had given me for my 75th birthday, the one I never wore around other people because it was too worn at the cuffs to be presentable. I wore it that day because it felt honest, because I wanted everything about that recording to be exactly what it was. Not polished, not arranged, just me, at the end of my life, telling the truth. I'm going to talk for a while, I said at the start of the video. Some of you are going to be uncomfortable with what I say. I'm asking you to stay in your seats until I'm finished. Irene told me later that at this point she looked sideways at Ethan without moving her head. She said his jaw was set in the particular way it did when he was working to show nothing. I talked for 41 minutes. I started with the beginning, the warehouse, the 2 machines, the rented space in a city that didn't know my name. I talked about what it cost to build something from nothing, not in romantic terms, but in real ones. Missed dinners. Unpaid hours. The winter my heating bill went unpaid for 2 months because I needed the money to fix a piece of equipment that was keeping 3 other families employed. The specific texture of what sacrifice actually feels like when you're living inside it, not looking back at it from a comfortable chair. I talked about Ruth. I talked about her the way I never talked about her with anyone, because I was not a man who talked easily about the things that mattered most to him. I talked about losing her, and about the way that loss had moved through our household, and about a boy sitting in her chair in the kitchen, staring at nothing, and how I'd handled that badly and known it and not known what to do differently. I talked about Patsy's diner, about Sunday mornings, about a kid with fast questions and good instincts and a quality of attention that made you feel like what you said mattered. And then I said, here is when things changed. I went through it in order. The unanswered calls, the letter that was never acknowledged, the taxi to the doctor's appointment, and the bench, and the yellow paint that Ruth had put there, chipped and faded. The office that became a storage room. The night I stood in a hallway at Marcus's birthday party and heard my grandson tell 2 strangers that I was not fully all there. I did not cry during any of it. I want to be clear about that. Not because I wasn't feeling it, I was feeling every word of it, but because tears would have made it easy to dismiss, would have made it a performance. What I wanted was something that couldn't be dismissed. A clear, steady account. A man sitting in a cardigan in a small apartment, talking the way you talk when you have nothing left to protect and nothing left to hide. When I got to the hallway, to Ethan's voice, to those words, I paused for a moment. Just a breath. Then I said, I want Ethan to know that I heard that. I want him to understand that every word he said in that hallway is in this recording and in the written record, and that the people who matter to me now know exactly what was said and exactly what it meant. Irene said that was when Claire finally looked away from the window. That was when Miriam stopped pretending to look at her phone. Ethan did not move. She said he sat completely still, which is its own kind of response. Then came the part of the recording that shifted everything. I also need to tell you about some things Ethan did that go beyond how he treated me personally, I said on the screen, because I spent months telling myself that it was a family matter, a private hurt, that it wasn't anyone else's business what went on between a grandfather and his grandson. I was wrong about that. Gerald, at this point in the room, opened a folder. On the video, I began to describe what I had documented over the preceding year. Not just the personal grievances, but the business decisions. Decisions Ethan had made at Whitmore Manufacturing that were not made in the interest of the company or its employees, but in the interest of Ethan. A contract with a vendor in which Ethan held an undisclosed financial interest. A conflict of interest that he had not declared to the board. A series of withdrawals from the company's discretionary account that were coded as operational expenses, but corresponded to no operational activity that anyone in the plant could verify. A meeting, documented, in which Ethan had discussed restructuring the community fund, the Whitmore Community Fund that Ruth had built, as a way to redirect its operating budget back into the company's liquid assets. He hadn't done that last one yet, but he'd discussed it, and the discussion had been documented by someone who'd been in the room, someone who'd worked for me for years, who'd seen the new version of Ethan up close, and who'd made the decision to tell me what they'd heard. Tommy Reyes. Tommy didn't want to be involved in any of this, I said in the video. He's a good man and a loyal employee, and I'm asking that whatever comes next, nobody holds this against him. He came to me because he thought I should know. He was right. I paused again on the screen. The room, by this point, was the kind of quiet that has weight to it. The kind where you can hear people breathing. I didn't build this company to fund someone's lifestyle, I said. I built it because 63 people depend on it, because the kids in the tutoring programs that Ruth started depend on it, because there are people in this community who are counting on the Whitmore name to mean something beyond a balance sheet. Another pause. I found out it doesn't mean that to Ethan, and that matters. That has to be part of the record. On the screen, I looked directly into the camera, the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that you see them clearly, that you have always seen them clearly, even when you let yourself pretend you didn't. Ethan, I said, I loved you like a son. I am telling you that plainly in front of everyone who matters to me because I want you to understand the full weight of what I'm about to say next. I loved you, and I watched you use that love to take what you wanted and then walk away. And I let you do it. For a long time I let you do it, because I kept waiting for the boy I raised to come back. A long pause, longer than the others. He didn't come back, and I had to accept that. And then I had to figure out what to do with everything I built, knowing what I know now. On the screen I reached forward and turned off the lamp beside me. The image shifted slightly, just the daylight from the window now, and the parking structure behind me, and an old man in a gray cardigan sitting in the truth of what his life had become. Gerald is going to tell you the rest, I said. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being in that room. The screen went dark. For a moment, nobody spoke. Irene said the silence lasted longer than felt comfortable, long enough that it stopped being silence and became something else, a pressure, a held breath. A room full of people absorbing something they hadn't been prepared for, even though some of them had been told to prepare. Then Ethan's attorney said something in a low voice to Ethan. Ethan didn't respond to him. He was staring at the dark screen with an expression that Irene described as blank. Not the managed blankness of someone controlling himself, but the genuine blankness of someone whose model of the world has just failed to match reality. Claire put her hand on his arm. He didn't seem to notice. Gerald set down his folder, opened it to the first page of the amended estate documents, and looked around the room. Mr. Whitmore asked me to give everyone a moment, he said. So I will. But when you're ready, we have quite a bit to go through. Dale across the table let out a long, slow breath. He wasn't looking at Ethan. He was looking at the screen where I had just been, at the space where my face had been, and his expression was complicated in a way that had nothing clean about it. Grief and vindication rarely sit well together. They don't cancel each other out. They exist in the same moment, side by side, both of them real. Miriam had her hand over her mouth. She was looking at the table. And Ethan. Ethan finally moved. He leaned forward, placed his hands flat on the table, and looked at Gerald with eyes that had changed in some way that was hard to name. Not angry. Not yet. Something more fragile than anger. Something that looked, underneath everything, almost like recognition. Almost like a man who has just seen himself from the outside for the first time. Gerald waited. The room waited. And then he turned to the first page of the amended documents and began. Gerald did not rush. That was the thing Irene mentioned first when she described the morning to me. Described it to the version of me that exists in this recording, the voice that's been carrying this story from the beginning. She said Gerald moved through those documents with the same deliberate pace he brought to everything, and that the slowness of it was its own kind of pressure. Every page he turned, every clause he read aloud in that measured, careful baritone added another layer to what was already sitting in that room like something physical, like weather. Ethan's attorney had recovered by then. He had the portfolio open in front of him, and he was writing, quickly, in the margin-cramped way of someone who has realized the meeting is not what he prepared for and is trying to catch up in real time. Ethan himself had gone very still beside him, not the composed stillness of a man in control, the rigid stillness of a man who has locked himself in place because moving might mean acknowledging what's happening. Claire was the only one who looked at Ethan during that first stretch of Gerald's reading. She kept glancing at his face, reading it for something. Whatever she found there, her expression didn't change. Gerald began with the structural overview. The estate, as originally filed, had been valued at $14.2 million at the time of the primary document's execution. In the months between that filing and my death, several things had changed. The manufacturing company's value had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Some of the liquid assets had been moved. Gerald walked through each of these with the patience of a man who knows that clarity is a form of power and is in no hurry to relinquish it. Then he got to the amendments. Mr. Whitmore executed 4 formal amendments to his estate documents in the 14 months prior to his death, Gerald said. Each amendment was filed with the court, witnessed independently, and accompanied by a notarized competency certification from a licensed clinical psychologist. He looked up briefly. At Ethan's attorney specifically, a look that acknowledged the objection before it was raised. All 4 are legally unimpeachable. Ethan's attorney stopped writing. We'll need to review the competency documentation before... It's in the supplementary packet in front of you, Gerald said. Tab 3. A pause. The attorney opened the packet, turned to tab 3, read for a moment, turned a page, read some more. He set it down. Ethan leaned toward him. A murmur. The attorney murmured back. Whatever he said, it landed badly. Ethan's jaw tightened in that particular way Irene had described from the video screening, and he straightened again and looked at Gerald. Go ahead, Ethan said. The First Amendment had been executed 11 months before my death. It concerned the Whitmore Community Fund. In the original estate documents, the fund had been listed as a subsidiary asset under the manufacturing company's umbrella, which meant its operational control defaulted to whoever controlled the company. Ethan. The First Amendment severed that relationship entirely. The fund was reestablished as a fully independent nonprofit entity with its own board of directors, a board I had spent 4 months quietly assembling, made up of educators, community members, and a financial administrator who had no connection to Whitmore Manufacturing. I had also, in that same amendment, increased the fund's endowment substantially. $3 million transferred from my personal liquid assets into the fund's independent account, irrevocable, with a charter that specifically prohibited any future attempt to redirect those funds toward private commercial interests. Gerald read the specific language of the prohibition. He read it clearly, and he did not hurry through it. Irene said she heard Dale exhale beside her, a long, slow breath, like a man letting go of something he'd been holding for a while. Ethan said nothing, but Irene watched his hand on the table, and she said the fingers tightened slightly, just slightly. The Second Amendment addressed the commercial properties, 2 buildings I'd held as investment assets for over a decade. In the original document, these had also fallen to Ethan. The amendment transferred one of them, the larger one on Clement Avenue, to Irene outright. Full title. No conditions. The second property went into a trust designated for the after-school tutoring programs, the income from its lease to fund program operations for a minimum of 15 years. At the mention of Irene's name, Ethan turned and looked at her. It was the first time he'd looked directly at anyone in the room since the video ended. Irene met his gaze and held it. She told me later she felt her heart rate spike, but she didn't look away. He looked back at Gerald. Continue, he said, and his voice had changed, still controlled but thinner, like fabric pulled too tight. The Third Amendment was the one about the scholarship program. I had never mentioned it publicly. Not to Irene, not to Dale, not to Gerald himself until I walked into that apartment meeting and laid it out. For the last 3 years of my life, I had been quietly setting money aside, a separate account, personal funds, nothing connected to the business, with the intention of creating a scholarship fund for students from the district where my plant was located. First-generation college students, specifically. Kids who were where I had been 60 years ago, at the beginning of something they couldn't fully see yet. The total amount was $1.4 million, set aside over 3 years, dollar by dollar, in an account Ethan had no knowledge of and no access to. The fund was named the Ruth Whitmore Scholarship. When Gerald read the name, Irene put her hand over her mouth. Dale looked at the ceiling. Miriam, who had been quiet for most of the morning, made a sound that she quickly covered. And I want to be honest about something. I did not name it after Ruth to make Ethan feel something. I named it after her because it was hers. Because she was the one who first talked about wanting something like this, sitting at our kitchen table 15 years ago, saying that the problem wasn't that people in this neighborhood weren't capable. The problem was that nobody gave them a reason to believe that capability was enough. She said that. I remember it clearly. And then she got sick and there was no time. And then she was gone. And I carried the idea with me because it was hers and I didn't know what else to do with it. The scholarship was my way of finishing what she'd started. Gerald read the terms. Criteria for eligibility, selection process, the independent committee that would administer it. His voice was steady throughout. He was a professional. But Irene said that at one point, when he read Ruth's name for the second time, he paused, just briefly, a breath, and then continued. She said she thought that was the most human moment of the entire morning. Bulky. Then Gerald came to the Fourth Amendment, the one about the manufacturing company itself. And this is where the room changed in a way that all the previous changes had only been preparing it for. Under the original estate documents, Gerald said, Whitmore Manufacturing was transferred in full to Ethan Cole, with sole operational and ownership authority. He turned a page. The Fourth Amendment modifies that structure significantly. Ethan's attorney sat forward. Ethan Cole retains a 22% ownership stake in Whitmore Manufacturing, Gerald said. The remaining 78% is redistributed as follows. He read the breakdown. 15% to a newly formed employee ownership trust, giving the long-term employees of the company, the 63 people I'd thought about when I signed the original documents, a genuine stake in the thing they'd spent their working lives building. 20% to Irene, in recognition of what Gerald described, reading directly from my written instruction as consistent, unglamorous, unrequested loyalty that asked nothing in return and gave everything that was needed. 18% held in trust for the community fund, its dividends to support the tutoring programs. The remaining 25% to a management consortium that Gerald had helped me establish. Experienced manufacturing operators, people who knew the industry and had no personal agenda beyond keeping the company healthy. Ethan would remain a stakeholder. He would receive dividends proportional to his share, but he would have no operational authority, no board seat, no ability to redirect, restructure, or make decisions about a company that would continue to bear the Whitmore name but would no longer be his to use however he chose. The room was very quiet when Gerald finished reading. Ethan's attorney broke it first. We're going to need to contest the competency certifications, the timeline of these amendments, the scale of the redistribution. You're welcome to pursue that, Gerald said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Dr. Patel's documentation is comprehensive. 2 independent reviews have already validated it. Harold Whitmore was assessed 4 times in the 14 months prior to his death, and all 4 assessments reached the same conclusion. He looked at the attorney the way a man looks at an argument he has already defeated. He was, in every measurable way, fully competent, sharper, frankly, than most people half his age. That's your characterization. That's Dr. Patel's characterization. In writing, under oath, tab 3. Ethan put his hand on his attorney's arm, a quiet gesture. The attorney stopped talking. Ethan looked at Gerald. Is that everything? There's one more item, Gerald said, not a legal document, a letter, written by Harold in his own hand, addressed to you specifically. He asked that it be read aloud in this room, in the presence of everyone here. Gerald looked at Ethan steadily. Would you like me to read it, Or would you prefer to take it privately? Something moved across Ethan's face, something that was hard to name. He was quiet for a moment. Read it, he said. I'll tell you what was in the letter, because it was mine and I know every word of it. I wrote it 4 drafts before I got it right. Threw the first 3 away, actually tore them up, and put them in the trash, because they were either too angry or too forgiving or some combination of both that felt dishonest. The 4th draft was what was left when I stopped trying to write the letter I thought I should write and just wrote what was true. It was not long. Ethan, I've said most of what I need to say in the video. What's left is this. I don't know what happened to you. I've spent more hours than I can count trying to understand it, and I've come to the conclusion that I'm probably not the right person to figure it out. You'll have to do that part yourself. What I know is that I made mistakes with you. After your grandmother died, I hid in work the way I always did. I wasn't there the way I should have been. I kept expecting grief to have a schedule, and it doesn't. And by the time I noticed you were struggling the way you were struggling, I'd already missed the window where I could have done something about it. That's on me. I'm not telling you that to excuse what came later, but because it's true, and a man who won't admit his own failures doesn't have the right to name anyone else's. What I cannot forgive, and I want to be honest with you about this because false forgiveness is its own kind of lie, is what you did to the people who depended on this company. Not to me. The things you did to me hurt, but I'm an old man and I've been hurt before and I know how to carry it. What you did to Tommy Reyes and the people on that floor, the decisions you were making with their livelihoods for your own benefit, that I cannot forgive. They trusted the Whitmore name. I trusted you with it. That trust was not yours to spend. I hope you figure out who you are without the money telling you. I hope that version of you is someone you can live with. Your grandfather, Harold Gerald finished reading. He folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. The room held its silence. Ethan was looking at the table. Not at the letter, not at Gerald, not at Irene or Dale, or any of the people who were now watching him with various degrees of pity and anger and complicated feeling, just the table, the grain of the wood. Claire said something to him quietly. He shook his head once. His attorney gathered the supplementary packet, straightened it, and said in a carefully neutral voice, "We'll need time to review all of this before our client decides on next steps." "Of course," Gerald said. "The standard response window applies. We'll be in touch." He began to stand. Ethan didn't move immediately. He sat there for another moment, and in that moment, Irene told me this, and I believe her because Irene doesn't embellish. Something crossed his face that was different from anything she'd seen on it all morning. Not anger, not strategy. Something younger. Something that looked, briefly, like the face of a boy sitting in a kitchen chair, staring at nothing, in the weeks after someone he loved was no longer there. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out without looking at anyone. Claire followed him. The attorney followed Claire, and the door closed behind them with a sound that was almost nothing at all. For a moment, the remaining people in the room just sat there. Then Dale said, "Well?" And then he didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else that fit. Irene had her hands flat on the table. She was looking at the closed door. When she finally looked away, she looked at Gerald, and she said, "He's going to fight it." "He'll try," Gerald said. "He won't succeed, but he'll try." "And the employees, the fund, while he's trying?" "Protected. The independent structures are already in place. The fund's account, the scholarship endowment. Those are untouchable regardless of what he files. The company ownership trust is registered. It doesn't require his cooperation to function." Gerald collected his documents with the efficiency of a man who has been preparing for this morning for a very long time. Harold was thorough. That's the word I keep coming back to. He was thorough in a way that left very little room for anything to go wrong. Irene nodded slowly. She looked down at the table, and then she said quietly, not to anyone in particular, "He always was." Miriam left shortly after, with a goodbye that was briefer than the occasion warranted, and a look on her face that said she had a great deal of thinking to do. Dale and Irene stayed a while longer, and Gerald made coffee in the small kitchen off the conference room, and the 3 of them sat together as the morning light shifted across the table and the city moved through its ordinary Wednesday below the windows. They didn't talk about Ethan much. They talked about the scholarship, about what it would mean for kids in the district, about Ruth, and what she would have thought of it, and whether she would have been satisfied with the name or whether she would have complained that it was too much attention on herself. She would have complained, Irene said, and then she would have loved it. Dale laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes unexpectedly and is slightly undone by emotion underneath it. Gerald stood by the window with his coffee and didn't say anything. He just let the conversation be what it was. Outside, somewhere in the city, Ethan Cole was sitting in a car, or a restaurant, or his attorney's office, doing the math, calculating, figuring out angles. It was what he did. It was probably what he would always do. I had accepted that about him in the end, that the boy I'd hoped was still somewhere inside the man had not disappeared exactly, but had learned to serve a different master. And that was not something I could fix, no matter how carefully I'd built the documents, no matter how thorough I'd been. You can restructure an inheritance. You can redirect a fortune. You can protect 63 livelihoods and fund a scholarship in your dead wife's name and speak your truth on camera for 41 minutes. But you cannot make someone understand what they lost until they're standing alone on the other side of it. That part was going to take longer. Maybe it would take the rest of his life. I hoped it didn't. I want to say that clearly. Whatever else I felt about what Ethan had become, I did not hope for his misery. I hoped for his reckoning, yes. And that reckoning was now underway, moving through the machinery of consequence like a stone dropped in still water, rings spreading outward in every direction. But misery is different from reckoning. Misery is just pain. Reckoning is pain, with the possibility of understanding on the other side of it. The stone was in the water. What he did with the rings was his to figure out. Ethan filed the contest 3 weeks after the estate meeting. Irene called Dale when the paperwork arrived at Gerald's office, and Dale called Miriam. And by the end of that evening, the quiet network of people who had sat in that conference room and watched everything change was buzzing with the particular anxiety that legal threats produce. Even when you know, rationally, that the ground beneath you is solid, knowing something is legally protected and feeling protected are two different things. Ethan understood that. It was, probably, the most sophisticated move he made in the entire aftermath. He couldn't win, and some part of him likely knew he couldn't win, but a contest creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates pressure, and pressure makes people doubt things they shouldn't doubt. Gerald called Irene the morning after the filing and said with the same measured calm he brought to everything, "This is expected. This changes nothing. The documentation is what it is." "He's going to drag it out," Irene said. "He's going to try." "How long?" Gerald paused. "If he's strategic about it, 6 months, possibly 8. Irene said she stood in her kitchen holding the phone and looked out the window at her backyard, where nothing in particular was happening, and thought about what 8 months felt like from the inside of it, about what it would cost people who were waiting, about Tommy Reyes and the 63 employees whose ownership stake was technically established but practically in limbo until the contest resolved, about the kids in the tutoring programs, about the scholarship that had been announced but not yet fully activated. "Okay," she finally said. "The fund is protected regardless," Gerald reminded her. "The scholarship endowment is protected. The only thing the contest touches is the manufacturing ownership structure, and even that, the employee trust is registered. He can slow the transition, but he can't undo it." "Okay," she said again. She told me later that she said it twice because the first time she said it, she didn't believe it, and the second time she was trying to. The contest collapsed in 4 months. Not 6, not 8. 4. What Ethan's attorney had not fully anticipated, and this was the thing I had counted on, the thing I had understood about Ethan that he did not understand about himself, was that the financial irregularities I'd documented in the video were not just part of the estate record. They were part of a separate referral that Gerald had quietly made to the appropriate regulatory body 6 weeks before the estate meeting. I had asked him to time it that way, to let the meeting happen first, to let Ethan hear everything in that room before the second wave arrived. The referral triggered an audit of Whitmore Manufacturing's accounts, covering the 18 months of Ethan's sole control. The audit was still ongoing when Ethan filed his contest. And when his attorney realized that contesting the estate's competency documentation would require putting Ethan in front of a judge at precisely the same moment a financial audit was examining his conduct, the same conduct documented in my notebook, in Tommy's account, in the video, the calculus changed. The contest was withdrawn on a Tuesday afternoon. Gerald called Irene. Irene called Dale. Dale made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then Irene drove to the cemetery. She told me this part slowly, the way she tells things she isn't sure she has the right to tell. She parked, walked to where I was buried next to Ruth. We're side by side, the way we'd asked to be. Simple markers, nothing elaborate. And she stood there for a while without saying anything. The grass was just starting to come in. It had been a wet spring. She said she finally told me that it worked, that it held, that Gerald sent his regards. She said she thought she felt something. She couldn't be sure, but she stood there a little longer than she'd planned to, just in case. The first Ruth Whitmore Scholarship was awarded in September. 8 recipients, all first-generation college students from the district. The youngest was 17, a girl named Destiny Okafor, who wanted to study environmental science and had written in her application essay about watching the creek behind her grandmother's house run brown every time it rained and wanting to understand why and wanting to fix it. Her essay had been one of the ones read aloud at the selection committee meeting, Irene told me, and 3 of the 5 committee members had needed a moment afterward. The award ceremony was held in the community center 3 blocks from the plant. Not a grand venue, folding chairs, a podium borrowed from the local library, a banner that Irene had made herself because the commercial one arrived with a typo and she'd driven to the print shop in a fury and redone it the night before. She told me about the typo like it was a personal affront, which it kind of was. Dale flew in for it. He sat in the second row with his wife and kept clearing his throat in the way people do when they're managing emotion they consider undignified to show. Tommy Reyes came with his wife and 2 of his kids. He wore a jacket I'd never seen him in before. He sat near the back, which was so Tommy that Irene almost laughed when she saw him there. Gerald came. He stood near the side wall with his coffee in a paper cup, looking at the room over the rim of it, with the expression of a man who has spent a career handling the aftermath of people's lives, and still, occasionally, finds himself surprised by what those lives add up to. A woman named Patricia Hale, the chair of the scholarship committee, spoke about Ruth first. She'd never met Ruth. She'd only read what I'd written about her in the fund's charter documents, and what community members had shared when the scholarship was announced. But she talked about her with a specificity that made Irene grip the armrest of her chair. She talked about a woman who believed that capability without opportunity was a tragedy that could be prevented, and who had spent her life trying to prevent it in whatever small ways were available to her, and who had apparently been talking about a scholarship for 15 years before one existed. Destiny Okafor shook Irene's hand afterward. She was small and serious, and she looked at Irene with the direct gaze of someone who wants you to know she is paying attention. "Did you know Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked. "I did," Irene said. "She was family." Destiny nodded. "She sounds like she was something." "She was," Irene said. "She really was." I want to talk about Ethan now, because this story would be dishonest if it ended without him, and I've been committed to honesty throughout. It's too late to stop. The audit concluded in November. The findings were what the evidence suggested they would be: the undisclosed vendor interest, the account irregularities, the discretionary fund withdrawals. The regulatory outcome was not criminal prosecution, which I want to be clear about. There was no criminal charge. What there was instead was a civil finding, a required restitution to the company, and a formal bar from serving as an officer or director of any business in which he held a controlling interest for a period of 5 years. 5 years. Not forever. Not a prison sentence. A consequence proportional to the conduct, which is, I think, what justice mostly looks like when it's functioning the way it's supposed to. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a door that closes for a specific period of time and a debt that has to be paid. He paid the restitution. It came from the liquid assets he'd retained. His 22% of the company generated dividends, and he was not left destitute, not by any measure. He was left considerably less comfortable than he'd planned to be, and without the platform and authority he'd spent 2 years positioning himself to hold. But he had enough. Whether he felt that was enough is a different question. Claire left in December. Irene heard this through Marcus, who heard it through someone else, and she told me with the careful neutrality of someone who is choosing not to have an opinion about it. I don't have much to say about Claire. I never knew her well enough to judge her fairly, and she was never really the center of this story. She was adjacent to it, a detail in someone else's reckoning. What I do know, and this came to me through the most unlikely channel, is that Ethan called Tommy Reyes in January. Tommy told Irene about it weeks later, still not quite sure what to make of it. He said Ethan called him on a Sunday, which was notable because Sunday had always been sacred ground in our family, and maybe that meant something, or maybe it didn't. He didn't apologize exactly, Tommy said. He didn't say sorry. He said he wanted me to know that he understood that I did what I had to do, that he didn't blame me. Irene asked what Tommy had said back. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then, I told him I appreciated that. And then I told him I hoped he was doing all right. Irene blinked. That's it? What else was I going to say, Tommy said. Man called me on a Sunday, took something to do that. There is a generosity in that response that I find difficult to match. Tommy Reyes has always been better at grace than I have. It's one of the many reasons I trusted him with the things I trusted him with. Whether Ethan will build anything from that Sunday phone call, from whatever it took for him to make it, I genuinely don't know. I hope so. I said that in the letter I wrote him, and I meant it. I hoped for his reckoning, not his ruin. Ruin is just an ending. Reckoning is a beginning, if you let it be. That part is his. I can't write it for him. The manufacturing company went through its ownership transition in the spring of the following year. The employee trust was activated, the management consortium took operational responsibility, and Whitmore Manufacturing entered its next chapter as a company that was, for the first time in its history, partly owned by the people who built things inside it every day. Tommy became a member of the Trust's advisory committee. He called Irene to tell her, and she said he sounded like a man who was trying not to sound as pleased as he was, which meant he was very pleased indeed. The company had a good year. Not spectacular, not the kind of growth that makes headlines, but solid and honest, and built on decisions made by people who had a genuine stake in the outcome. The kind of year Ruth would have called a good year without qualification. Irene took ownership of the Clement Avenue property and leased it to a community health clinic that had been looking for a larger space. She told me the rent was below market rate, which I figured she'd do. She's never been good at optimizing for money when there's another way to optimize. It's one of the best things about her. The family, the actual family. The one that had been quietly fracturing under the weight of Ethan's social engineering for 2 years, found its way back to something functional. Not perfect. Not the uncomplicated warmth of the early years before Ruth died, before everything got complicated, but real. Miriam called Irene in the spring, and they had a long conversation that Irene described to me as difficult and necessary and ultimately okay. Not okay like everything was fine. Okay, like two people who'd been on opposite sides of something hard had decided to try to be on the same side again. That's about as much as you can ask of people, I think. To try. Now I want to speak directly to you, because I've been carrying this story for a long time, and this is the part where I set it down. I am Harold Whitmore. I built something from nothing. I loved a woman for 41 years, and I was not always the husband she deserved, and I know that, and I carry it. I raised a boy who was not my obligation and poured into him everything I had, and he became someone who used what I gave him in ways I did not anticipate and could not protect against until it was almost too late. I made mistakes throughout all of it. I held back when I should have spoken. I hid in work when I should have sat in the kitchen. I said I was fine when I was not fine, for so long that the habit of saying it almost cost me everything I was trying to protect. But here's what I learned. Here is what I want you to hear, not as a lesson handed down from someone who figured it all out. I didn't figure it all out, not even close. But as the plain truth of an old man who had to learn it the hard way, in a small apartment with a parking structure outside his window and a notebook in his nightstand. Love is not a transaction. It was never supposed to be. The moment you hand someone everything you have and expect that act of giving to bind them to you, to obligate them, to change them, you have confused love with leverage. They are not the same thing. I gave Ethan everything I had because I loved him, and that was right. But I gave it without conditions, without accountability, without ever asking him to demonstrate that he understood what it cost. And in doing so, I did not protect him from himself. I made it easier for him to become the worst version of who he could be. That is a painful thing to say. It is the most painful thing in this entire story, for me. More painful than the office that became a storage room. More painful than the bench in the cold. More painful than the hallway where I heard my grandson's voice describe me as not fully there. Because those things were done to me by someone else. This, the way I enabled what came after, the years of silence and forgiveness that cost me nothing and changed nothing. This I did myself. So if you are listening to this and you recognize something of your own life in it, if there is someone in your family who takes and takes and takes, and you keep giving because you love them, and love is supposed to be enough, I want to tell you what I know from the other side of it. Love is not enough when the other person has decided not to offer it back. At some point, love without a boundary is not love. It is just loss waiting to happen. Set the boundary. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of self-respect. Out of the understanding that your dignity has value, regardless of who you are to someone, regardless of how much you've given them, regardless of how much you want it to be different than it is. You have the right to protect what you've built. You have the right to redirect it toward people and purposes that deserve it. You have the right to speak, even if you have to speak to a camera in a small apartment at the end of your life, even if you can't be in the room when the words land. Speak anyway. Do it anyway. Because the alternative, the going quietly, the swallowing of it, the endless patience that asks nothing and receives nothing, the alternative is that the people who should have been protected aren't, and the things that should have mattered don't outlast you, and the story ends without a record. I didn't want to end without a record. The roses came back at the family estate in the spring. Irene planted them. She told me she went to the garden center and found the same variety, a deep pink climbing rose, the kind Ruth had planted originally, and she bought 6 of them and drove to the estate on a Saturday morning and rang the bell. Nobody answered. The house was unoccupied by then, part of the estate in transition, and Irene had the legal right to be there. So she went around to the front garden, and she dug out 2 of the boxwood hedges that Claire's decorator had installed, and she planted the roses where they belonged. She said it took 3 hours, and her knees were killing her afterward, and she broke 2 nails and got mud on her good jacket, and she didn't regret a single second of it. She left the remaining boxwoods in place. Not everything needed to be undone. Just the roses. Just that one thing that shouldn't have been taken out in the first place. I think that's right. I think that's how restoration actually works. Not by erasing everything that happened, not by pretending the hard years didn't occur, but by going back to the specific things that mattered and putting them where they belong. One at a time. Getting mud on your jacket. Breaking a nail. Making it so that someone driving past on a spring morning might see those roses and not know the whole story behind them, but know that someone planted them on purpose, with care, and that they were worth planting. That's enough. That's what a legacy looks like when it's real. Not a monument, not a plaque, not a name on a building. Just something that keeps growing after you're gone, because someone who loved you made sure it had ground to grow in. Ruth understood that before I did. She understood most things before I did. That was the arrangement between us, and it suited me fine. Wherever she is, I hope she knows about the roses. I hope she knows about Destiny Okafor and Tommy on the advisory committee and the clinic on Clement Avenue and 8 kids who got a letter in the mail this fall telling them that someone they never met believed their capability was worth something. I hope she knows I finished what she started. That's the whole of it. That's the story. I want to talk about Ethan now, because this story would be dishonest if it ended without him, and I've been committed to honesty throughout. It's too late to stop. The audit concluded in November. The findings were what the evidence suggested they would be. The undisclosed vendor interest, the account irregularities, the discretionary fund withdrawals. The regulatory outcome was not criminal prosecution, which I want to be clear about. There was no criminal charge. What there was instead was a civil finding, a required restitution to the company, and a formal bar from serving as an officer or director of any business in which he held a controlling interest for a period of 5 years. 5 years. Not forever. Not a prison sentence. A consequence proportional to the conduct, which is, I think, what justice mostly looks like when it's functioning the way it's supposed to. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a door that closes for a specific period of time and a debt that has to be paid. He paid the restitution. It came from the liquid assets he'd retained. His 22% of the company generated dividends, and he was not left destitute, not by any measure. He was left considerably less comfortable than he'd planned to be, and without the platform and authority he'd spent 2 years positioning himself to hold. But he had enough. Whether he felt that was enough is a different question. Claire left in December. Irene heard this through Marcus, who heard it through someone else, and she told me with the careful neutrality of someone who is choosing not to have an opinion about it. I don't have much to say about Claire. I never knew her well enough to judge her fairly, and she was never really the center of this story. She was adjacent to it, a detail in someone else's reckoning. What I do know, and this came to me through the most unlikely channel, is that Ethan called Tommy Reyes in January. Tommy told Irene about it weeks later, still not quite sure what to make of it. He said Ethan called him on a Sunday, which was notable because Sunday had always been sacred ground in our family, and maybe that meant something, or maybe it didn't. He didn't apologize exactly, Tommy said. He didn't say sorry. He said he wanted me to know that he understood that I did what I had to do, that he didn't blame me. Irene asked what Tommy had said back. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then, I told him I appreciated that. And then I told him I hoped he was doing all right. Irene blinked. That's it? What else was I going to say? Tommy said. Man called me on a Sunday. Took something to do that. There's a generosity in that response that I find difficult to match. Tommy Reyes has always been better at grace than I have. It's one of the many reasons I trusted him with the things I trusted him with. Whether Ethan will build anything from that Sunday phone call, from whatever it took for him to make it, I genuinely don't know. I hope so. I said that in the letter I wrote him, and I meant it. I hoped for his reckoning, not his ruin. Ruin is just an ending. Reckoning is a beginning if you let it be. That part is his. I can't write it for him. Well, the manufacturing company went through its ownership transition in the spring of the following year. The employee trust was activated, the management consortium took operational responsibility, and Whitmore Manufacturing entered its next chapter as a company that was, for the first time in its history, partly owned by the people who built things inside it every day. Tommy became a member of the Trust's advisory committee. He called Irene to tell her, and she said he sounded like a man who was trying not to sound as pleased as he was, which meant he was very pleased indeed. The company had a good year. Not spectacular, not the kind of growth that makes headlines, but solid and honest and built on decisions made by people who had a genuine stake in the outcome. The kind of year Ruth would have called a good year without qualification. Irene took ownership of the Clement Avenue property and leased it to a community health clinic that had been looking for a larger space. She told me the rent was below market rate, which I figured she'd do. She's never been good at optimizing for money when there's another way to optimize. It's one of the best things about her. The family. The actual family. The one that had been quietly fracturing under the weight of Ethan's social engineering for 2 years, found its way back to something functional. Not perfect. Not the uncomplicated warmth of the early years, before Ruth died, before everything got complicated. But real. Miriam called Irene in the spring, and they had a long conversation that Irene described to me as difficult and necessary and ultimately okay. Not okay like everything was fine. Okay like two people who'd been on opposite sides of something hard had decided to try to be on the same side again. That's about as much as you can ask of people, I think. To try. Now I want to speak directly to you, because I've been carrying this story for a long time, and this is the part where I set it down. I am Harold Whitmore. I built something from nothing. I loved a woman for 41 years, and I was not always the husband she deserved, and I know that, and I carry it. I raised a boy who was not my obligation and poured into him everything I had, and he became someone who used what I gave him in ways I did not anticipate and could not protect against until it was almost too late. I made mistakes throughout all of it. I held back when I should have spoken. I hid in work when I should have sat in the kitchen. I said I was fine when I was not fine, for so long that the habit of saying it almost cost me everything I was trying to protect. But here's what I learned. Here is what I want you to hear, not as a lesson handed down from someone who figured it all out. I didn't figure it all out, not even close, but as the plain truth of an old man who had to learn it the hard way, in a small apartment with a parking structure outside his window and a notebook in his nightstand. Love is not a transaction. It was never supposed to be. The moment you hand someone everything you have and expect that act of giving to bind them to you, to obligate them, to change them, you have confused love with leverage. They are not the same thing. I gave Ethan everything I had because I loved him, and that was right. But I gave it without conditions, without accountability, without ever asking him to demonstrate that he understood what it cost. And in doing so, I did not protect him from himself. I made it easier for him to become the worst version of who he could be. That is a painful thing to say. It is the most painful thing in this entire story, for me. More painful than the office that became a storage room. More painful than the bench in the cold. More painful than the hallway where I heard my grandson's voice describe me as not fully there, because those things were done to me by someone else. This, the way I enabled what came after, the years of silence and forgiveness that cost me nothing and changed nothing, this I did myself. So if you're listening to this and you recognize something of your own life in it, if there is someone in your family who takes and takes and takes, and you keep giving because you love them, and love is supposed to be enough, I want to tell you what I know from the other side of it. Love is not enough when the other person has decided not to offer it back. At some point, love without a boundary is not love. It is just loss waiting to happen. Set the boundary, not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of self-respect, out of the understanding that your dignity has value regardless of who you are to someone, regardless of how much you've given them, regardless of how much you want it to be different than it is. You have the right to protect what you've built. You have the right to redirect it toward people and purposes that deserve it. You have the right to speak, even if you have to speak to a camera in a small apartment at the end of your life, even if you can't be in the room when the words land. Speak anyway. Do it anyway. Because the alternative, the going quietly, the swallowing of it, the endless patience that asks nothing and receives nothing, the alternative is that the people who should have been protected aren't, and the things that should have mattered don't outlast you, and the story ends without a record. I didn't want to end without a record. The roses came back at the family estate in the spring. Irene planted them. She told me she went to the garden center and found the same variety, a deep pink climbing rose, the kind Ruth had planted originally, and she bought 6 of them and drove to the estate on a Saturday morning and rang the bell. Nobody answered. The house was unoccupied by then, part of the estate in transition, and Irene had the legal right to be there. So she went around to the front garden, and she dug out 2 of the boxwood hedges that Claire's decorator had installed, and she planted the roses where they belonged. She said it took 3 hours, and her knees were killing her afterward, and she broke 2 nails and got mud on her good jacket, and she didn't regret a single second of it. She left the remaining boxwoods in place. Not everything needed to be undone. Just the roses. Just that one thing that shouldn't have been taken out in the first place. I think that's right. I think that's how restoration actually works. Not by erasing everything that happened, not by pretending the hard years didn't occur, but by going back to the specific things that mattered and putting them where they belong. One at a time. Getting mud on your jacket, breaking a nail, making it so that someone driving past on a spring morning might see those roses and not know the whole story behind them, but know that someone planted them on purpose, with care, and that they were worth planting. That's enough. That's what a legacy looks like when it's real. Not a monument, not a plaque, not a name on a building, just something that keeps growing after you're gone, because someone who loved you made sure it had ground to grow in. Ruth understood that before I did. She understood most things before I did. That was the arrangement between us, and it suited me fine. Wherever she is, I hope she knows about the roses. I hope she knows about Destiny Okafor, and Tommy on the advisory committee, and the clinic on Clement Avenue, and 8 kids who got a letter in the mail this fall telling them that someone they never met believed their capability was worth something. I hope she knows I finished what she started, That's the whole of it. That's the story.